When she spoke about a major victory for Indigenous children in Canada, the country listened.
This is a complete victory for children. It strips away any sensibility that First Nations children are being treated fairly by the Government of Canada today.
She was passionate, pointed, and no one was left wondering just how she felt.
Children only get one childhood. They can't wait for studies. They shouldn't have to wait for studies. The government knows what to do for this generation of children. They just have to get down to doing it.
Cindy Blackstock has been at the forefront in a decades-long national debate about the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians, and what she has to say needs to be heard.
Why did we have to bring the Government of Canada to court to get them to treat First Nations children fairly? Little kids. Why would it ever be okay to give a child less than other children? One of the non-Aboriginal children that we work with said, discrimination is when the government doesn't think you're worth the money. So what would it feel like if you weren't worth the money? What would it feel like if you were the parent of a child who wasn't worth the money?
So ever since the first day that I saw you at that news conference, I was wondering about you and about your story and what's impacted your life, because you were so comfortable on the stage that day in front of the national media and in front of the country. And everybody who was with me that day in the newsroom watching went, who is that person? Like, where did she come from? So let me ask you that in a specific way. I mean, when looking back on your life, was there one moment that you can point to that says, that's what helped me focus my mind on the issues that matter?
I grew up in the huckleberry fields in northern British Columbia in the 1960s, Peter. And I saw racism all around me. I didn't have words for it back then. I just saw that First Nations people were seen to be lesser than everybody else. And what I couldn't figure out is what we had done wrong. Even as a 5-year-old little kid, I couldn't figure out what we'd done wrong. And so that sense of injustice followed me, that question about why is it that we're treated so differently? And why is it so okay? I remember even as a little girl watching some of the civil rights movement stuff on TV. We had the CBC in black and white in those days, that's all we had. And I saw all these people rising up against racism. And yet, in our country, it was seen to be normal. It was seen even to be benevolent. The problem wasn't that First Nations people were being treated less. It was that the Canadians were being so generous to them was the problem. That was in the public parlance. And that always confused me.
So you were 5 when you first recognized that. So all these years later, do you see it differently, or is it still the same?
I think it is starting to change, but it is fundamentally the same problem.
But we've heard it's starting to change so many times over those 40, 50 years. Why is this different? Why do you really think things are starting to change?
Because I think with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that the stories are getting harder to turn away from. I think we need to go through the same process that they did in the civil rights movement in Mississippi and different places. For so long you can kind of keep this racist ball moving, but at some point the stories start to pound up so that the conscience of the nation can no longer turn away. The TRC did a little bit of that, and I'm hoping that our work with children has done that people can see that really what we have is racist fiscal policies by the federal government that have persisted since Confederation and continue to pile up on the hopes and dreams of children. I hope that's enough to shake the conscience of the nation, to get Canadian people to realize that the only way the government's going to change is if they insist it changes.
A racist fiscal policy by the federal government, and I guess by governments generally.
Yes.
I mean, that's a very powerful phrase to use.
Yes.
Do you think they even realize it?
I don't know. Like I know in the federal government,
there's planned racist policies. Apartheid.
Yeah.
You're not talking about anything planned. You're talking about something that just became a part of the system, systemic,
Right, and for which, though, the government knew about the inequalities, in our case, in the child welfare case. They knew about it going back 16 years, Peter. They agreed that it created harms for children. They had solutions available to fix it, and yet they didn't fix it. So even when you bring that to their attention, that you are discriminating against these kids, the system perpetuates the discrimination versus addressing it, not just in child welfare, but across all areas of these children's experience.
Are we a racist country?
Yes, I think we are. I think we're born in racism as a matter of governance. But my real hope is with Canadians, because I don't think caring Canadians are racist by nature. I think that it's become so normalized in the fabric of the relationship between First Nations and non-Aboriginal people that it's hard to figure out. And it's also very confronting for non-Aboriginal Canadians because they don't think about themselves that way. They certainly don't think about their government that way. But I'm inviting them to embrace what hurts. Because to me, true patriotism is when you really face up to those issues that fall out of alignment with your national values, and that we stand together to bring it into alignment, not just for the 163,000 First Nations kids, but for the country too.
Tell me what racism looks like from the side you're seeing it.
I think the scariest thing about it is it's so normalized, it becomes invisible to most people. But what we have seen for children is that the provincial and laws for education, health, and child welfare apply on and off reserves, but the federal government funds it and has funded it for many, many decades. But they underfund those services by about 20 to 40% less. So you can imagine if you're a kid, you get less funding to stay safely in your family, you get less funding for school, you're in one of your 6 First Nations don't even get clean water to drink. And yet from the outside, people that don't know any better are judging you as if you get more. And so the real horror of this, for me, is when I see these kids start to internalize the idea that they're not worth the money. And that's the real pain of racism.
And when does that start happening?
Very young, very young.
5, 6?
Yeah, well, I can just say for myself, like I just really realized, even as a very young kid, that there was something really wrong in society with being First Nations. You didn't go to university. There weren't high expectations of you. Everything that was a negative characteristic was somehow a characteristic of the entire group. And if you managed to have a positive characteristic, that wasn't generalized across the whole group in the same way, right? You were somehow this exception to the rule. And I think that we have still that to confront in Canadian society today.
You know, you mentioned a moment ago about the experience south of the border and what African Americans have gone through. You seem to suggest that they've passed a point, that they're in a better way than we are, and yet when you look at what's happening south of the border,
Right.
the whole Black Lives Matter issue, the question of whether they're treated fundamentally different by law enforcement agencies than whites. Is there really improvement there?
Well, I think where I see the difference is in the conscience of the nation, that they know enough that that kind of discrimination is unacceptable.
And you don't see that here?
We don't see that here. We're not at that level of alertness yet because Canadians simply don't understand that this systemic discrimination is happening. And so as that word gets out, and we reach that topple point where it no longer becomes acceptable in the hearts and minds of Canadians that this racial discrimination continues by government or by any other source, then we are going to have to confront these other issues that follow. And certainly I'm not putting out that the African American situation is as good as it should be. Clearly it's not. But at least those issues get talked about in the national media. You know, like when this case came down about the federal government being found to racially discriminate against 163,000 children. It was covered very well for a couple of days, but then it's gone silent again.
It's gone silent and it's not resolved.
And it's not resolved. The federal government has not ruled out an appeal, nor have they taken any concrete steps to improve the lives of these children, which is the real reason why we brought this case in the first place.
And when you ask them why they haven't, what do they tell you?
They say they're reviewing the decision. And that has been what the government has said for the last 148 years. You know, one of the things that we need to get away from, both as First Nations and I think as non-Aboriginal people too, is the concept of incremental equality, I call it. It's the idea that you take cross-cutting inequalities, and you just address them one topic at a time. So I can see in the upcoming budget they're going to announce money for education. That's great. And they'll probably now announce money for child welfare since they've been ordered to do it. But what about housing? What about water, right? I have a report back in my office written on a typewriter, and it says, can anyone hazard a guess as to what year or what century real equality will be achieved for Indian children in education? That was written in 1967, Peter. I was 3 years old, and we're still at it. We need to understand with all of our heart and mind and soul that equality for kids is something you do in a leap, not in a shuffle.
Still to come.
So when a prime minister feels that he has to say, Indigenous lives matter,
Yeah,
that's a good thing.
it's a good thing.
More with First Nations advocate Cindy Blackstock.
I don't know if it's like the hype of being here and getting the opportunity to speak to the Prime Minister. This is my Auntie Dorothy, and this is my cousin Samantha. And she went missing in Kamloops, and then my auntie went missing in the downtown east side.
I want to show you something. You watched, I think you had the opportunity to see Face to Face, the program we did with 10 Canadians who came, sat in the Prime Minister's office alone with him, just them and the cameras, and challenged him on certain issues. And one of the most moving, most emotional moments was when Nikki from Kamloops in BC confronted him on the whole issue of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. I want to show you just a little bit of it, because something happens in that interview that at least I found quite remarkable. And I want to see how you feel about it. So this is Nikki with Justin Trudeau.
Our RCMP have had a really horrible track record when it comes to dealing with missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls cases. The proof is out there that they just, lack of a better word, just don't feel like an Indigenous woman's life is valued.
Well, there are big changes to make institutionally right across the board. The RCMP is part of it, but the culture of politics and government is a big part of it as well. This matters. Indigenous lives matter. I mean, that you even have to say that is you know, frustrating to me.
Yeah.
And then you demonstrate it. How old's your daughter?
She's 3. Her name is Ayanna Rose.
Ayanna Rose.
And I have a son. His name is Trey.
And how old is Trey?
5.
No, it keeps everything in perspective and priority.
Yeah, it does, and that's why I'm here, is because of them. I don't want her to have to grow up in a country where I have to feel like her life is less valuable than a non-Indigenous little girl life.
So, you know, a number of things in that conversation where, you know, struck, you know, a chord with a lot of people. The one that really impacted me was that the Prime Minister of Canada would say that Indigenous lives matter, that he felt a need to have to say that.
Yeah.
What did you make of that?
I think he does need to say it time and time again, because there have been so many times when I've seen First Nations children die, and it just gets glossed over. One of the ones that came to mind that day when I was talking in Parliament about the day of the announcement was Shannon Kustachin.
My name is Shannon Kustachin. I feel down because Minister Chuck Straw, he said he didn't have the money to build our school. I didn't believe that. And it's not right.
I mean, here we had a little girl who was 13 years old, who had spent her whole childhood trying to fight for a school that because her sat on a toxic waste dump at 30,000 gallons of diesel fuel in Northern Ontario. And she and her friends were getting sick from the portable trailers that Canada put on the playground of that contaminated school. And she would plead with the government, she would plead with Canadians, just give us a school so we can learn, so we can grow up and be somebody important. and she's 13 years old. There's this high school in her community, but it's so underfunded. She knows that she'll never be able to be that human rights lawyer to fight for the education rights of all kids in Canada that she wants to be, not on that underfunded education. So she makes a journey hundreds of miles to go to school off reserve, and it's the first time she stood in a proper school. She's walking down the hallway, Peter, and she finds herself in a classroom. And she's picking up all the things that other kids had to learn all these years, and tears are streaming down her face. And when she's asked what's wrong, she says, I wish I had my life to live over again so I could go to a school as nice as this. It was not too many months after that, that on the highway, on her way to the school that she would have never gone to had the one at her home been properly funded, that she dies in an automobile accident. There are lots of Shannon Coustachians out there. The Canadian government isn't killing those children, but they're putting them in situations where their deaths are far more likely, where their lives are not lived in a way that they should be lived, where they haven't had the opportunities of other kids. And to me, losing one Shannon Coustachian should be enough to wage the conscience of the nation, but it hasn't been. And I think that's what we see in this story too from Nikki. You know, the murdered and missing women just become that, something, a statistic, instead of real people. And her calling us to, what are we going to do for her daughter? That's a real question. So what are we going to do with our daughter?
So when a prime minister feels that he has to say, Indigenous lives matter,
Yeah.
that's a good thing.
It's a good thing, because it has to be part of the Canadian conversation. We have to inch our ways forward to that uncomfortable truth about the country, which is that there has been two Canadas. The one for everyone who's come here since and people who are coming here now, and the one for First Nations, Métis and Inuit peoples who have been routinely discriminated against, marginalized and dehumanized in order to really feed the political economy of the non-Aboriginal state. And I think that there's a lot of caring Canadians who can see that now.
If there's another uncomfortable truth, it's the very fact that billions of dollars have been spent in trying to come to grips with the situation that so many Indigenous Canadians face. And of those billions, it's on the record that some of them, a lot of them, have been misspent. Not just by non-Indigenous groups, but by Indigenous groups. So you know there are people watching this right now who are saying, come on, give me a break. They've had every chance, we've spent all this money. What do you say to that kind of comment?
Well, one of the things I think is important to recognize is that I don't think it's a fair comment to say the majority of First Nations people are not managing their money well. In fact, the Auditor General looked at this and found that the rates of money mismanagement are pretty much the same as in the non-Aboriginal community. Of course there are First Nations people, Métis and Inuit people, who are not managing the money well, and in fact are probably engaging in some kind of criminal activity, but we're not alone in that. What is so concerning to me is that we take these few examples of individuals and we make it a cultural trait and use that cultural trait, that stereotype, misinformation, to legitimize discrimination against little kids.
That's all becomes part of the systemic
It becomes part of the
racism.
systemic, yeah, because it's interesting. I was there in Ottawa when the First Nations Accountability Act was being talked up and being put through by the Conservative government. And at the same time, I'm seeing all of that really, quite frankly, fraud in Montreal and sometimes in the Prime Minister's office. And no one is saying we need a Caucasian Male Accountability Act. They are automatically seen as being exceptions to the rule. And I think that's a proper way of seeing people. You can't put a broad brush across everybody and say everyone's up to no good. That's not fair. But when it comes to First Nations, it's seen to be the legitimate course of action. And I don't agree with that. I think that you have to deal with individuals who are behaving improperly, but the vast majority of people aren't.
When we come back.
Children are the great hope of reconciliation. They know how to do it. We just need to follow their example.
Final thoughts with Cindy Blackstock in just a moment.
Have a heart day for me. is about learning from the Indigenous peoples of our country what justice means.
In many different areas of our lives right now, we seem to be being led by youth.
Yeah.
They're telling us, you guys have got it all wrong. You don't know what you're talking about. We even see it in the U.S. presidential race now, where young people are playing such a dominant role. What are young people? Are they part of this systemic racism that you witness, or are you seeing a turn there? I mean, the young people of the past, myself included, grew up and it didn't challenge it, until it just became so blatant. But young people today, and I'm talking young people, do they see it in a way we didn't?
That's my greatest hope for the country. One of the things that's so inspiring to me has been to see how children have reacted to this case. Even before the adults ever clued in, the non-indigenous children, they are experts in love and fairness, Peter. Kids are. And they know when something's wrong, and they want to do something to make it right. So when Canada was up to dismissing this thing on technicalities, one of the first groups to ever show up were a group of high school students. And one of the young men came over and he said, we're from alternative school, which means we get into trouble a lot. And sometimes we deserve it, but sometimes it's the system that deserves to be in trouble. And no one ever tackles the system, but you are, and you're saying you want our help, so we're here. And at the next set of hearings, they not only came, they came in T-shirts and brought their friends who have researched this. They see that this racial discrimination is going on. As one non-Aboriginal girl, she said, discrimination is when the government doesn't think you're worth the money. And she said, I think every child is worth the money. So I'm going to write letters to the Prime Minister. I'm going to do whatever I can to make this a country worthy of every child in this country. And so hundreds and thousands of children have not only shown up to watch the case, but they understand that when they are going to have to keep writing these letters until the world pays attention to them. So children are the great hope of reconciliation. They know how to do it. We just need to follow their example.
Well, let's leave it on that note. This has been a fascinating discussion, and I think we'll probably need to do it again.
I'll look forward to it.
Thank you.
Thanks.